The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Windsor Castle like secrets waiting to be revealed. Inside the royal residence, Queen Camilla stood before her bedroom window, watching the sun struggle through the grey clouds. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman who had weathered countless storms, yet today felt different. Today carried the weight of decisions that would change everything. The ornate clock on her mantel chimed 7 times, its sound echoing through chambers that had housed monarchs for nearly 1,000 years. Camilla turned away from the window, her silk nightgown rustling softly as she moved toward her dressing table. The woman staring back at her from the mirror had come so far from the young cavalry officer's daughter who once rode horses across the Wiltshire countryside without a care in the world. Her personal secretary, Margaret, knocked gently before entering with the morning tea service. The silver tray clinked softly as it was placed on the small table by the fireplace. Margaret had served the royal household for over 30 years, and her weathered hands moved with practiced precision as she arranged the china cups and saucers. "Your Majesty, the King requests your presence in his study at 8:30, Margaret said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality that came from decades of royal service. "He mentioned it concerns the matter you both discussed last evening." Camilla nodded, accepting the delicate porcelain cup filled with Earl Grey. The tea was perfectly brewed, just as it had been every morning for the past 2 decades, yet today it tasted different. Everything tasted different when you were contemplating the end of an era. "Has there been any word from the press office about the announcement?" Camilla asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil beneath the surface. "The palace communications team has been in meetings since dawn, Your Majesty. They're preparing several drafts for your review," Margaret replied, arranging fresh flowers in a vase near the window. "The Prime Minister's office has also called twice this morning." Camilla set down her cup with trembling fingers. The decision she and Charles had reached after months of private discussions was about to become public knowledge. The weight of the crown, both literal and metaphorical, had been pressing down on her shoulders for longer than she cared to admit. She rose from her chair and walked to her wardrobe, where rows of carefully tailored suits and elegant dresses hung in perfect order. Each piece of clothing represented a public appearance, a duty fulfilled, a role played for the benefit of the nation. Today, she chose a simple navy dress with pearl buttons, something understated yet dignified for what lay ahead. As she dressed, Camilla's mind wandered to the early days of her relationship with Charles. The scandal, the public outcry, the years of being painted as the villain in a fairy tale gone wrong. She had endured it all with grace, slowly winning over a skeptical public through decades of tireless charitable work and unwavering support for her husband. The transformation from public enemy to beloved queen consort had been neither quick nor easy. Every smile, every handshake, every ribbon cutting had been a step toward redemption. She had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of public opinion while maintaining her own sense of dignity and purpose. Margaret returned to help with the final touches of her morning preparation. As the lady-in-waiting fastened a simple strand of pearls around Camilla's neck, she could see the emotion flickering in her mistress's eyes. "Your Majesty, if I may speak freely," Margaret said softly, her fingers gentle as she adjusted the clasp. "The people have come to love you. Whatever decision you and His Majesty have made, they will understand." Camilla met Margaret's eyes in the mirror, seeing decades of loyalty and affection reflected there. "I hope you're right, Margaret. I truly hope you're right." The walk to Charles's study felt longer than usual, her heels clicking against the polished marble floors of the castle's ancient corridors. Portraits of long-dead monarchs watched her pass, their painted eyes seeming to judge every step she took toward an uncertain future. Charles was seated behind his mahogany desk when she entered, surrounded by newspapers, official documents, and correspondence from government officials. His reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, and his brow was furrowed with concentration as he reviewed what appeared to be multiple versions of a press statement. "My darling," he said, looking up as she approached. "I trust you slept well." It was a gentle lie between them. Neither had slept well in weeks, not since they had begun seriously discussing the path that lay before them. The burden of monarchy was not something either had taken lightly, and the decision they were about to announce had been months in the making. "As well as can be expected," Camilla replied, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "Have you made your final decision about the timing?" Charles removed his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. At 76, he had waited longer than any heir apparent in British history to assume the throne. The weight of that weight, combined with the enormous responsibilities that came with wearing the crown, had taken its toll on both of them. "The palace communications team believes we should announce it this afternoon," he said, his voice heavy with the gravity of the moment. "They want to control the narrative before the press starts speculating." Camilla nodded, understanding the delicate dance they had to perform with the media. After decades in the public eye, she knew how quickly rumors could spiral out of control and how important it was to present a united front when making major announcements. "And William? Kate? Have they been informed?" she asked, referring to the Prince and Princess of Wales. "I spoke with William last night," Charles confirmed. "He understands our reasoning, though I could tell he's concerned about the additional responsibilities this will place on his shoulders." The mention of William brought a slight smile to Camilla's face. The relationship between her and Charles's eldest son had evolved dramatically over the years. What had begun as awkward formality had gradually transformed into genuine mutual respect and affection. William had come to see her not as an interloper, but as a stabilizing force in his father's life. "He's ready," Camilla said with conviction. "He and Catherine both are. They've been preparing for this moment their entire marriage." Charles stood and walked to the tall windows that overlooked the castle grounds. In the distance, he could see the changing of the guard taking place, a ceremony that had continued uninterrupted for centuries. The sight reminded him of the continuity of the monarchy, how institutions could endure even as individuals came and went. "I never imagined we would be having this conversation so soon," he admitted, his back still turned to her. "When I finally became king, I thought we would have more time." Camilla rose and joined him at the window, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "We've had a lifetime together, Charles. That's more than many people ever get." The weight of her words hung in the air between them. Their love story had been unconventional, marked by scandal and separation, but it had endured through decades of public scrutiny and private challenges. Now, as they faced their greatest test yet, they drew strength from the bond that had sustained them through everything else. A soft knock at the door interrupted their moment of reflection. Charles's private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, entered with a folder of documents that required immediate attention. "Your Majesties," he said with a respectful bow. "The final draft of the announcement is ready for your review. The Prime Minister has also requested a private call at your convenience." Charles accepted the folder and returned to his desk, with Camilla reading over his shoulder as he reviewed the carefully crafted words that would change everything. The statement was written in the formal language of royal communications, but beneath the diplomatic phrasing lay a deeply personal decision that had been months in the making. "The wording seems appropriate," Camilla said after they had read through it twice. "It explains our reasoning without going into unnecessary detail." "The public deserves an explanation," Charles agreed. "But some things must remain private." As they made final adjustments to the statement, Camilla found herself thinking about her grandchildren and how this decision would affect their lives. The royal family was not just an institution, it was a collection of real people with real emotions, fears, and hopes for the future. The telephone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Sir Clive answered and spoke in hushed tones before turning to Charles. "Sir, it's the Archbishop of Canterbury. He says it's urgent regarding the announcement." Charles accepted the call, his face grave as he listened to the Archbishop's concerns. The conversation was brief but intense, touching on constitutional issues that needed to be addressed before any public announcement could be made. "Yes, Your Grace, we understand completely," Charles said into the receiver. "We wouldn't dream of proceeding without proper consultation with all relevant parties." After ending the call, Charles turned to Camilla with a weary expression. "There are more complications than we anticipated. The Archbishop wants to meet with us before we release any statement to the press." Camilla felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. Even after all these years, the complexity of royal protocol continued to surprise her. Every decision, no matter how personal, had to be filtered through layers of constitutional law, religious doctrine, and political considerations. "When does he want to meet?" she asked. "This morning, if possible. He's driving down from Lambeth Palace now." The next few hours would be crucial in determining not just the timing of their announcement, but potentially its content as well. Camilla understood that the Archbishop's concerns likely centered on the precedent their decision would set for future monarchs and the impact it might have on the Church of England's relationship with the Crown. As they waited for the Archbishop's arrival, Camilla found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the early days of their friendship, through the dark period of scandal and separation, to their eventual marriage and her gradual acceptance by the British people, every step had led to this crossroads. The irony was not lost on her that the woman once vilified as a homewrecker was now being asked to make a sacrifice for the good of the monarchy. The transformation of her public image had been one of the most remarkable rehabilitation stories in modern royal history. She thought about her children, Tom and Laura, and how this decision would affect them. They had grown up in the shadow of their mother's complicated relationship with the heir to the throne, weathering storms of negative publicity while trying to maintain normal lives and careers. Margaret appeared in the doorway, announcing that the Archbishop had arrived and was waiting in the blue drawing room. Charles and Camilla exchanged a look of mutual support before rising to meet with the man who would play a crucial role in determining their immediate future. As they walked through the castle's corridors once again, Camilla felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. Every queen before her had faced moments of difficult decisions, times when personal desires had to be weighed against public duty. Today, she would add her own chapter to that long and complicated story. The Archbishop stood as they entered the room, his face reflecting the gravity of the situation. Archbishop Geoffrey was a man of deep faith and careful consideration, someone who understood both the spiritual and constitutional implications of royal decisions. "Your Majesties," he said with a respectful bow. "Thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice. I felt it was imperative that we discuss the ramifications of your intended announcement before it becomes public knowledge." Charles gestured for the Archbishop to sit, and the three of them arranged themselves around a small table near the fireplace. The formality of the setting seemed at odds with the deeply personal nature of their discussion, but Camilla had learned long ago that royal life was full of such contradictions. "Your Grace, we appreciate your concern," Charles began. "But this decision has not been made lightly. We've considered all the implications, both personal and constitutional." The Archbishop nodded thoughtfully. "I don't doubt that, Your Majesty. However, there are certain religious and legal precedents that must be addressed. The coronation oath, for instance, creates obligations that cannot simply be set aside." Camilla listened as the two men discussed the technical aspects of kingship, the religious ceremonies that bound a monarch to his duties, and the constitutional framework that governed royal decision-making. Her role in the conversation was limited, but her presence was crucial as a reminder of the human element in these grand institutional discussions. "What concerns me most," the Archbishop continued, "is the message this sends about the permanence of royal commitment. The monarchy's strength has always been its stability, its unchanging nature in a world of constant flux. But, surely," Camilla interjected gently, "there's also strength in recognizing when circumstances require difficult decisions? In choosing what's best for the institution rather than personal preference?" The Archbishop turned to her with surprise, as if he had forgotten she was there. It was a reaction Camilla had encountered many times over the years, the assumption that she was merely a decorative presence rather than an active participant in royal decision-making. "Your Majesty raises an interesting point," he acknowledged. "Perhaps we should examine this from multiple perspectives." The conversation continued for over an hour, covering everything from constitutional law to public relations, from religious doctrine to family dynamics. Through it all, Camilla found herself admiring Charles's patience and wisdom as he navigated the complex web of interests and concerns that surrounded their decision. Finally, the Archbishop leaned back in his chair and sighed deeply. "I cannot say I'm entirely comfortable with your proposal, but I understand your reasoning. If you're determined to proceed, we must ensure that every aspect is handled with the utmost care and dignity." Charles reached across the table and shook the Archbishop's hand. "Thank you for your guidance, Your Grace. We know this isn't easy for any of us." After the Archbishop departed, Charles and Camilla found themselves alone again, the weight of their decision heavier than ever. The complications raised during their meeting had added new layers of complexity to what they had hoped would be a straightforward announcement. Are you having second thoughts? Charles asked, studying Camilla's face for any signs of doubt. Camilla considered the question carefully before responding. No, she said finally. This is still the right decision. But, I'm beginning to understand why no one has attempted this before. The afternoon sun was streaming through the windows when they finally approved the final version of their statement. The words had been carefully chosen to balance honesty with discretion, explanation with privacy. Every sentence had been scrutinized by lawyers, communications experts, and constitutional scholars. As evening approached, Camilla retreated to her private sitting room to gather her thoughts before the announcement was released to the press. The room was filled with personal mementos, photographs of family and friends, books that had sustained her through difficult times. She picked up a silver-framed photograph of herself and Charles taken on their wedding day in 2005. They both looked older now, marked by years of public service and personal challenges, but the love in their eyes remained unchanged. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else. Margaret knocked softly and entered with the evening tea service, a ritual that had remained constant through all the changes and challenges of royal life. The statement will be released at 6 o'clock, Your Majesty, Margaret informed her. The press office expects significant media attention. Camilla nodded, accepting her cup of tea with hands that trembled slightly. In less than an hour, their private decision would become public knowledge, subject to analysis, criticism, and speculation from around the world. Margaret, she said softly, whatever happens in the coming days, I want you to know how grateful I am for your loyalty and friendship all these years. Margaret's eyes misted with emotion. It has been my honor to serve you, Your Majesty. You've shown more grace under pressure than anyone has a right to expect. As the clock approached 6, Camilla could hear increased activity in the corridors outside her room. The palace staff was preparing for the media storm that would inevitably follow their announcement. Phone lines would ring constantly, reporters would gather outside the gates, and royal correspondents would begin crafting their analysis of this unprecedented situation. At precisely 6 o'clock, the official statement was released simultaneously to all major news outlets. Within minutes, breaking news alerts were flashing across television screens, and social media was exploding with reaction to the news that would change the British monarchy forever. Camilla remained in her sitting room, listening to the distant sounds of increased activity throughout the castle. She knew that by tomorrow morning, their decision would be front-page news around the world, analyzed and debated by constitutional experts, royal historians, and ordinary citizens alike. The first part of their journey was now complete. The secret they had carried for months was finally in the open, and there would be no turning back from the path they had chosen. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them with the same dignity and commitment that had carried them through every other crisis in their remarkable partnership. The morning after the announcement brought chaos that even the most experienced palace staff had never witnessed. By dawn, hundreds of reporters and camera crews had gathered outside the gates of Windsor Castle, their equipment creating a forest of microphones and satellite dishes that stretched as far as the eye could see. Inside the castle, Queen Camilla sat in her private study, surrounded by newspapers from around the world. Every front page carried headlines about their decision, each publication offering its own interpretation of what the royal announcement meant for the future of the monarchy. The headlines ranged from supportive to sensational, but all acknowledged that something historic had just occurred. Her personal phone had been ringing constantly since the early hours of the morning. Friends, family members, and former colleagues were all reaching out, some offering support, others seeking clarification about what the announcement really meant. Margaret had finally taken the phone off the hook to give Camilla some peace to process the magnitude of the moment. Charles knocked softly before entering, carrying his own stack of newspapers and a weary expression that reflected the sleepless night they had both endured. The gravity of their decision had become even more real as they watched the world react to news that had been months in the making. "How are the children handling it?" Camilla asked, referring to both their biological children and the extended royal family who would all be affected by this unprecedented situation. "William called again this morning," Charles replied, settling into the chair across from her desk. "He's concerned about the constitutional implications, but he's supportive of our decision. Catherine sends her love and wants you to know she's available if you need to talk." The relationship between Camilla and Catherine had evolved into one of genuine affection and mutual respect over the years. The Princess of Wales understood the unique pressures that came with marrying into the royal family, and she had often sought Camilla's advice on navigating the complex world of royal protocol and public expectations. "And, Harry?" Camilla asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Charles's expression darkened slightly. No word from California. His silence speaks volumes. The estrangement between Charles and his younger son continued to be a source of deep pain for the entire family. Harry's decision to step back from royal duties and relocate to America had created a rift that seemed to widen with each passing year. Camilla had always hoped that time would heal the wounds, but their current situation seemed likely to create even more distance. A gentle knock interrupted their conversation. Sir Clive entered with an urgent expression and a phone in his hand. "Your Majesties, I have the Prime Minister on line 1. He says it's imperative that he speak with you both immediately about the parliamentary response to yesterday's announcement." Charles accepted the phone with visible reluctance. The political implications of their decision were something they had discussed extensively, but the reality of dealing with government officials was proving more complex than anticipated. "Good morning, Prime Minister," Charles said, his voice formal and measured. "I trust you've had time to review our statement." Camilla could only hear Charles's side of the conversation, but his increasingly tense posture told her that the Prime Minister was raising concerns they hadn't fully anticipated. The relationship between the monarchy and elected government was delicate under the best of circumstances, and their announcement had introduced complications that would require careful navigation. "I understand your position, Prime Minister, but this decision has been made after months of careful consideration," Charles said firmly. "We're not seeking approval, we're informing you of our intentions as a courtesy." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Charles becoming increasingly adamant about their right to make this choice without governmental interference. When he finally ended the call, his face was flushed with frustration. "What did he want?" Camilla asked, though she suspected the answer would be complicated. "He's concerned about the precedent this sets and the potential constitutional crisis it might create," Charles explained. "He wants us to delay any further action until Parliament can debate the implications." Camilla felt a surge of anger at the suggestion that their personal decision should be subject to political debate. After decades of serving the public interest, often at great personal cost, the idea that politicians would try to dictate their private choices was deeply offensive. "This isn't a matter for Parliament," she said firmly. "We're not asking permission to make a decision about our own lives." "That's exactly what I told him," Charles agreed. "But he's threatening to involve the Privy Council and potentially challenge our authority on constitutional grounds." The mention of the Privy Council added a new layer of complexity to their situation. As the formal body of advisors to the sovereign, the council had significant influence over constitutional matters and could potentially create serious obstacles to their plans. Margaret appeared in the doorway with a silver tray bearing their morning tea, but her usual calm demeanor was replaced by obvious anxiety. Even the most veteran palace staff were struggling to cope with the unprecedented nature of the situation. "Your Majesties," she said carefully, "the palace communications team is requesting an urgent meeting. They say the media response is overwhelming their capacity to manage the narrative." Charles and Camilla exchanged a look of weary resignation. They had known that their announcement would generate significant attention, but the scale of the media frenzy was exceeding even their most pessimistic projections. "Schedule the meeting for this afternoon," Charles instructed. "And make sure the entire senior staff is present. We need everyone working from the same information." As Margaret departed to arrange the meeting, Camilla walked to the window and gazed out at the crowd of journalists still gathered outside the castle gates. Each person in that crowd represented thousands of readers, viewers, or listeners who would form their opinions about the royal family based on whatever narrative emerged from this chaos. "Do you think we underestimated how difficult this would be?" she asked Charles, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles joined her at the window, placing a supportive arm around her shoulders. "Perhaps. But that doesn't mean we made the wrong decision. Sometimes doing the right thing requires accepting that it won't be easy." Their moment of quiet reflection was interrupted by the arrival of Princess Anne, Charles's sister, who had driven down from Gloucestershire immediately after hearing the news. Anne had always been known for her direct manner and unwavering loyalty to the crown, qualities that made her both a valuable ally and a formidable critic when she disagreed with family decisions. "I came as soon as I could," and said without preamble. "We need to talk about the implications of what you've announced." The three of them moved to Charles's study, where Anne immediately took charge of the conversation with her characteristic efficiency and directness. "The family is divided," she announced bluntly. "Edward and Sophie are supportive, but they're concerned about the precedent. Andrew is focused on his own problems. The cousins are mostly staying quiet, but there's definitely concern about what this means for the institution." Camilla appreciated Anne's honesty, even when it was difficult to hear. The Princess Royal had never been one to soften harsh truths or avoid uncomfortable conversations, qualities that made her perspective particularly valuable during challenging times. "What about the public reaction?" Charles asked. "What are you hearing from your engagements?" "Mixed," Anne replied honestly. "Some people are sympathetic and understand your reasoning. Others feel betrayed or confused. There's a lot of uncertainty about what comes next, and people don't like uncertainty when it comes to the monarchy." The afternoon meeting with the communications team proved to be even more challenging than anticipated. The palace press office was struggling to keep up with requests for interviews, statements, and clarifications from media outlets around the world. Social media was exploding with opinions, theories, and speculation about the royal family's future. "We need to get ahead of this narrative before it spirals completely out of control," advised the head of communications, a sharp woman named Victoria who had managed royal crises for over a decade. "Right now, there are too many unanswered questions, and that's allowing speculation to fill the void." Charles leaned back in his chair, his exhaustion evident after less than 24 hours of intense scrutiny. "What do you recommend?" "A televised address," Victoria said without hesitation. "Something personal but dignified, explaining your reasoning in your own words rather than letting others interpret your decision for you." The suggestion of a televised address made Camilla's stomach clench with anxiety. She had given many public speeches over the years, but the idea of addressing the nation about such a personal decision felt overwhelming. "How soon?" Charles asked. "Ideally, within the next 48 hours, Victoria replied. "Every day we wait gives the opposition more time to build their case against you." The mention of opposition surprised Camilla. She hadn't fully considered that their decision would create organized resistance, but, in hindsight, it seemed inevitable that some groups would oppose any change to traditional royal protocol. "What kind of opposition are we talking about?" she asked. Victoria opened a thick folder filled with press clippings and social media printouts. "Constitutional monarchists who believe this undermines the stability of the crown. Religious groups concerned about the spiritual implications. Political opportunists looking to score points with traditional voters. And, unfortunately, some elements that are using this as an excuse to question the relevance of the monarchy altogether." The last point hit Camilla particularly hard. The idea that their personal decision might be used to attack the institution they had devoted their lives to serving was deeply troubling. "We need to frame this correctly," Charles said thoughtfully. "This isn't about abandoning responsibility, it's about ensuring the monarchy continues to serve the people effectively." Over the next few hours, they worked with the communications team to develop a strategy for managing the ongoing crisis. Every aspect of their public response would need to be carefully coordinated, from the timing of statements to the choice of venues for public appearances. As evening approached, Camilla found herself in her private sitting room once again, but this time she wasn't alone. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had arrived unannounced and was sitting quietly in one of the antique chairs, her presence both surprising and comforting. "I hope you don't mind," Catherine said softly. "William thought you might need a friend tonight." Camilla felt tears threatening for the first time since the announcement had been made. Catherine's kindness was exactly what she needed at a moment when everything felt uncertain and overwhelming. "I'm glad you're here," Camilla admitted. "I feel like I'm drowning in all the implications we didn't fully consider." Catherine moved to sit beside Camilla on the small sofa, her manner gentle but supportive. When William and I were going through our difficult period with the press, you told me something that helped enormously. You said that doing the right thing for your family was more important than doing the popular thing for the public. The reminder of her own advice brought a sad smile to Camilla's face. It was easier to offer wisdom than to follow it, especially when the stakes felt so monumentally high. This feels different, Camilla said. This affects the entire institution, not just our personal lives. Does it? Catherine asked gently. Or does it actually strengthen the institution by showing that the royal family is composed of real people making difficult decisions for the right reasons? Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tom and Laura, Camilla's children from her first marriage. Both had driven to Windsor as soon as they could arrange childcare and work commitments, their faces showing the strain of watching their mother become the center of a global media storm. "Mum," Laura said, embracing Camilla tightly, "we came as soon as we could. Are you all right?" Tom, typically more reserved than his sister, nevertheless showed his concern through his immediate presence and the way he studied his mother's face for signs of distress. "I'm managing," Camilla replied, though the relief at seeing her children was obvious. "I'm sorry you both have to deal with this circus." "We've been dealing with circuses related to your relationship with Charles for decades," Tom said with a wry smile. "At least this time, it's a circus of your own choosing." His attempt at humor was exactly what Camilla needed to break the tension that had been building throughout the day. For a moment, surrounded by people who loved her unconditionally, she could forget about constitutional crises and media narratives and simply be a mother and stepmother dealing with a difficult family situation. Catherine excused herself to allow the family privacy, but not before squeezing Camilla's hand and promising to call the next morning. Her visit had been brief but meaningful, a reminder that Camilla wasn't facing this challenge alone. As the evening wore on, more family members arrived at Windsor. Prince Edward and Sophie came up from Surrey, their faces serious but supportive. Even some of the extended royal family made appearances, creating an impromptu gathering that felt both comforting and overwhelming. Charles moved through the castle, speaking with various family members and trying to gauge their reactions to the announcement. The conversations were difficult but necessary, as the decision would ultimately affect everyone who bore the royal name. Later that night, as the last visitors departed and the castle settled into its usual evening quiet, Charles and Camilla found themselves alone in their private quarters. The day had been exhausting, emotionally draining, and full of complications they hadn't anticipated. "Are you having regrets?" Charles asked as they prepared for bed. Camilla considered the question carefully. The day had been difficult, but it had also reinforced her conviction that they were making the right choice, even if it wasn't the easy choice. "No regrets," she said finally. "But I'm beginning to understand why this has never been attempted before. The personal cost is higher than I expected." "We knew it wouldn't be simple," Charles reminded her. "But we also knew it was necessary." As they settled into bed, Camilla could hear the distant sounds of the media encampment outside the castle walls. Television crews were broadcasting live updates, reporters were filing stories for morning newspapers, and social media was buzzing with analysis and speculation about what the royal announcement really meant. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new complications, and new pressures. The Prime Minister would likely call again, the communications team would have new crises to manage, and the family would need to present a united front despite their private disagreements and concerns. But tonight, for just a few hours, Camilla allowed herself to find peace in the decision they had made. Whatever happened next, they had chosen to prioritize what they believed was best for the monarchy's future, even knowing it would come at significant personal cost. The woman who had once been vilified as a homewrecker was now making perhaps the greatest sacrifice of her life for the good of the institution that had eventually embraced her. The irony wasn't lost on her, but it also felt somehow fitting. Her entire relationship with the royal family had been about transformation, redemption, and the power of perseverance in the face of seemingly impossible odds. As sleep finally claimed her, Camilla's last conscious thought was about the televised address they would need to give soon. Finding the right words to explain their decision to a skeptical public would be crucial to determining whether their choice would be remembered as a courageous act of leadership or a devastating blow to the monarchy's stability. The next phase of their journey was about to begin, and everything would depend on their ability to convince the world that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for an institution is to step aside when its future requires it. The woman who had waited decades to become queen was about to show the world what queenly sacrifice really looked like. 3 days after the initial announcement, Windsor Castle had become the epicenter of a constitutional debate that was dividing not just Britain, but the entire Commonwealth. Queen Camilla stood in the mirror room, rehearsing her upcoming televised address for what felt like the 100th time. Each run-through brought new concerns from the communications team, new suggestions from constitutional experts, and new pressures from government officials who seemed determined to influence every word she would speak to the nation. The room itself was steeped in royal history, its walls lined with portraits of monarchs who had faced their own crises and challenges. Camilla found herself particularly drawn to the portrait of Queen Mary, Charles's great-grandmother, who had navigated the abdication crisis of 1936 with dignity and strength. The parallels between their situations were not lost on her, though the circumstances were entirely different. "Your Majesty, perhaps we should reconsider the opening paragraph," suggested Robert, the palace's senior speechwriter, who had been working around the clock to craft words that would satisfy the competing demands of honesty, diplomacy, and damage control. "The constitutional lawyers are concerned that the current version might be interpreted as criticism of the institution itself." Camilla sighed deeply, feeling the weight of every word choice and its potential implications. She had given hundreds of speeches during her years as a working royal, but never had the stakes felt so monumentally high. Every phrase would be analyzed by constitutional scholars, dissected by political commentators, and judged by a public that remained deeply divided about their decision. "The opening needs to be authentic," she insisted. "We can't sound like we're reading from a legal document. People need to understand this comes from the heart." Charles entered the room carrying yet another stack of documents, his face showing the strain of dealing with increasingly complex constitutional challenges. The Prime Minister had called 3 more times since their initial conversation, each call bringing new demands for clarification and new threats of governmental intervention. "The Archbishop wants another meeting," Charles announced without preamble. "He says there are religious implications we haven't adequately addressed. Apparently, several bishops are questioning whether our decision violates the sacred nature of royal coronation vows." The religious dimension of their situation was one aspect Camilla had hoped to avoid discussing publicly. Her own relationship with faith was deeply personal, shaped by decades of public scrutiny and private struggle. The suggestion that their decision represented some form of spiritual betrayal felt particularly painful. "What does he specifically want to discuss?" she asked. "The sanctity of the coronation oath," Charles replied, settling heavily into one of the room's antique chairs. "The bishops are arguing that making this decision shows a fundamental misunderstanding of the divine nature of kingship." Camilla felt a flash of anger at the suggestion that she didn't understand the gravity of royal responsibility. She had spent years studying constitutional history, royal protocol, and the religious foundations of monarchy. Her decision wasn't made from ignorance but from a deep understanding of what the institution truly needed. Margaret appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely controlled panic. "Your Majesties, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation developing outside. The crowds have tripled in size, and the police are concerned about maintaining order." Through the tall windows, they could see the massive gathering that had formed beyond the castle gates. What had started as a media encampment had evolved into something resembling a political rally, with supporters and opponents of their decision facing off in increasingly tense confrontations. "Are there any signs of violence?" Charles asked with obvious concern. "Not yet, sir, but the rhetoric is becoming quite heated. Some groups are calling for your abdication, while others are demanding that you reverse your decision entirely." The news that their personal choice had sparked public unrest added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. Camilla had never imagined that their announcement would create such passionate responses from ordinary citizens. Victoria, the communications director, burst into the room with her phone pressed to her ear and papers scattered across her arms. "We have a problem," she announced without waiting to be acknowledged. The story has gone international in a way we didn't anticipate. The President of France wants to make a statement about the stability of European monarchies. The German Chancellor's office has called asking for clarification about Commonwealth implications. And, she paused dramatically, the White House has asked for a briefing on how this affects the special relationship. Charles buried his head in his hands. This is exactly what we wanted to avoid. Our private decision becoming an international incident. It's too late for that now, Victoria said bluntly. The question is how we manage the global implications without losing control of our own narrative. The afternoon brought a parade of visitors, each with their own perspective on the crisis that was unfolding around them. Princess Anne returned with detailed reports from her conversations with various Commonwealth representatives, many of whom were expressing concern about the precedent being set. The Canadians are particularly worried, and reported during an emergency family meeting in the Grand Reception Room. They're asking whether this decision affects the constitutional monarchy there. The Australians are using it as an excuse to revive Republican sentiment. And, the Caribbean nations are questioning whether this represents a fundamental change in how the Crown approaches its responsibilities. Prince Edward and Sophie had been fielding calls from European royal houses, most of whom were watching the situation with a mixture of sympathy and concern about how it might affect their own institutions. The Scandinavian monarchies are supportive, Edward reported. They understand the pressures of modern royal life. But, the Spanish and Dutch are more concerned about maintaining traditional protocols. William and Catherine arrived later in the afternoon, both looking exhausted from dealing with the constitutional implications that would directly affect their future roles. As next in line, William was being consulted by government officials, constitutional experts, and Commonwealth representatives about his readiness to assume additional responsibilities. The Privy Council wants to meet tomorrow, William announced. They're claiming this decision requires formal consultation before it can be implemented. Camilla felt her anxiety spike at the mention of formal consultation. The idea that their personal choice would be subject to bureaucratic review and potential veto was deeply troubling. On what grounds? Charles demanded. This isn't a constitutional crisis. It's a personal decision about our own lives. They're arguing that any decision affecting the succession or the Crown's stability requires their input, Catherine explained. The constitutional lawyers are divided about whether they have the authority to intervene, but they're planning to try. The evening brought an unexpected visitor that changed the entire dynamic of their situation. Harry called from California, his first communication since the announcement had been made. Charles took the call privately in his study while the rest of the family waited anxiously for news about whether the prodigal son would offer support or criticism. When Charles emerged from his study 20 minutes later, his expression was unreadable. Harry is flying to London tomorrow, he announced simply. He says we need to discuss this as a family before anything else happens. The news that Harry was returning, even temporarily, sent shockwaves through everyone present. His relationship with the family had been strained for years, and his decision to step back from royal duties had created lasting tensions. For him to voluntarily return at this moment suggested that even he understood the magnitude of the situation they were facing. Did he say anything about his position on the announcement? William asked carefully. Only that he wants to understand our reasoning before the family makes any more public statements, Charles replied. I think he's concerned about the impact on the monarchy's future, whatever his personal feelings might be. That evening, as Camilla prepared for another sleepless night, she found herself in her private chapel, a small space within Windsor Castle that had provided comfort during many previous crises. The simple altar and stained glass windows created an atmosphere of peace that felt in stark contrast to the chaos surrounding them. She knelt before the altar and tried to pray, but found herself struggling to find words that adequately expressed the complexity of her emotions. The decision they had made felt right in her heart, but the unfolding consequences were testing her faith in ways she hadn't anticipated. Margaret found her there an hour later, gently touching her shoulder to let her know that Charles was looking for her. The older woman's presence was comforting, a reminder of the personal relationships that endured despite the institutional pressures surrounding them. Your Majesty, Margaret said softly, in all my years of service, I've never seen a situation quite like this. But I want you to know that the staff, almost to a person, supports your decision. We see how much this has cost you, and we respect the courage it has taken." Camilla felt tears forming for the first time since the crisis began. The support of the palace staff, people who had worked alongside the royal family for decades and understood the true nature of royal service, meant more than all the constitutional arguments and political posturing.
"Thank you, Margaret. That means more than you know. There's something else, ma'am. We've been monitoring the mail and emails coming into the palace. For every angry letter, we're receiving 2 supportive ones.
The British people understand sacrifice, and many of them recognize what you're doing." The walk back to her quarters took Camilla through the castle's long corridors, past portraits of monarchs who had ruled for centuries. Each face reminded her that the monarchy had survived countless crises, adapted to changing times, and endured because it served something larger than any individual personality. Charles was waiting in their private sitting room, surrounded by constitutional documents and legal opinions that had been arriving throughout the day. His reading glasses were perched on his nose, and his brow was furrowed with concentration as he tried to navigate the complex web of precedents and protocols that governed royal decision-making. "The legal situation is more complicated than we anticipated," he admitted as she settled into the chair across from his desk. "There are questions about whether we have the unilateral authority to make this decision, or whether it requires parliamentary approval."
"Since when does Parliament govern our personal choices?" Camilla asked, though she suspected the answer would be more complex than she hoped.
"Since our personal choices affect constitutional arrangements that have been in place for centuries," Charles replied wearily. "The lawyers are arguing that this sets a precedent that could destabilize the entire system of constitutional monarchy." The suggestion that their decision could destabilize the monarchy was the one criticism that truly worried Camilla. She had spent years supporting the institution, working to strengthen its relationship with the public, and helping to modernize its approach while maintaining its essential character.
"Do you think they're right?" she asked quietly.
Charles removed his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes.
"I think change is always destabilizing in the short term.
But I also think institutions that can't adapt to new circumstances are destined to become irrelevant." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sir Clive with news that would complicate their situation even further. The tabloid newspapers were planning to run extensive coverage the next morning that would include unauthorized interviews with former palace staff, speculation about health issues, and analysis that painted their decision in the worst possible light.
"They're going to question your motivations, Your Majesties," Sir Clive warned. "Some of the coverage will suggest this is about avoiding responsibility rather than accepting it." The prospect of having their motives misrepresented in the press was particularly painful for Camilla.
She had spent decades dealing with negative media coverage, but the suggestion that she was somehow shirking duty rather than making a difficult sacrifice felt deeply unfair.
"Is there anything we can do to counter the narrative before it takes hold?"
Charles asked. "The televised address is more crucial now than ever," Sir Clive replied. "You need to get your version of events out before the opposition has time to solidify their interpretation." As the night deepened, Camilla found herself standing once again at her bedroom window, looking out at the media encampment that showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, the crowd seemed to be growing larger, with supporters and opponents of their decision maintaining their vigil despite the late hour. The woman who had once been the most hated person in Britain was now facing perhaps her greatest test of public opinion. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same media apparatus that had once vilified her for breaking up a marriage was now criticizing her for trying to strengthen an institution. Charles joined her at the window, and together they watched the spectacle unfolding beyond the castle walls. Somewhere in that crowd were people who genuinely cared about the monarchy's future, others who were simply caught up in the drama of the moment, and still others who were using the situation to advance their own political agendas. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Charles said softly, "we face it together." Camilla leaned against his shoulder, drawing strength from the partnership that had sustained them through every previous crisis. Together, she agreed, though she couldn't shake the feeling that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. The clock chimed midnight, marking the beginning of another day in what was rapidly becoming the defining crisis of their reign.
Tomorrow would bring Harry's arrival, the Privy Council meeting, and, potentially, the televised address that could determine whether their decision would be accepted or rejected by the nation they had devoted their lives to serving. As she finally prepared for bed, Camilla realized that the easy part of their journey was over. Making the decision had been difficult, but defending it and seeing it through to its conclusion would require reserves of strength and courage that would test everything she had learned about public service, personal sacrifice, and the true meaning of royal duty. The woman who had transformed herself from public enemy to beloved queen was about to discover whether a lifetime of service had earned her the right to choose her own ending to an extraordinary story. The arrival of Prince Harry at Windsor Castle created a media frenzy unlike anything seen since his wedding day. Television helicopters circled overhead as his motorcade approached the ancient gates, while hundreds of photographers and reporters jostled for position to capture images of the prodigal prince's return. Inside the castle, the family had gathered in the oak drawing room, their faces reflecting the complex emotions that Harry's presence always seemed to generate. Camilla stood near the tall windows, watching as Harry's car disappeared into the castle's private courtyard. She hadn't seen her stepson in person for over 2 years, and their last interaction had been strained and formal. The prospect of discussing their momentous decision with someone who had his own complicated relationship with royal duty felt both necessary and daunting. When Harry finally entered the room, the years of separation were immediately apparent. He looked older, more weathered by the experiences of building a new life outside the royal bubble. His casual clothing and relaxed demeanor stood in stark contrast to the formal atmosphere that typically governed family meetings at Windsor. "Harry," Charles said, rising to embrace his son with obvious emotion. The hug lasted longer than protocol would typically allow, a moment of pure paternal affection that temporarily pushed aside years of hurt and misunderstanding. Camilla stepped forward as Harry turned to greet the rest of the family. Their relationship had always been complex, shaped by his mother's memory and his own struggles with accepting his father's second marriage. But time and maturity had softened the edges of their interactions, replacing open hostility with cautious respect. "Camilla," Harry said simply, offering a brief but genuine embrace. "Thank you for allowing me to be part of this conversation." William and Catherine greeted their brother-in-law with warmth tinged by uncertainty. The brothers' relationship remained strained, damaged by Harry's public criticisms of royal life and his decision to step away from his duties. But the gravity of the current situation seemed to have temporarily suspended their personal differences. Princess, and ever practical, immediately took charge of organizing the family discussion. "We need to understand where everyone stands before we make any more public statements," she announced, gesturing for everyone to take seats around the ornate conference table that dominated the center of the room. Harry settled into a chair across from his father and stepmother, his expression serious as he studied their faces. "I need to understand your reasoning," he said directly to Camilla. "This decision affects all of us, whether we're working royals or not." Camilla appreciated his directness, even as she felt the weight of having to justify such a personal choice to someone who had himself rejected royal duty when it became too difficult to bear. "We believe this is what's best for the monarchy's future," she began carefully. "Sometimes institutions need to adapt in ways that require personal sacrifice." "But you're not just any person making a personal sacrifice," Harry replied. "You're the Queen. Your decisions have constitutional implications that go far beyond your own preferences." William leaned forward, his role as heir apparent giving his words additional weight. "Harry, they've been dealing with pressures that you chose to walk away from. Perhaps we should listen to their reasoning before passing judgment." The subtle criticism in William's words created immediate tension in the room. Harry's decision to step back from royal duties remained a sensitive topic, particularly when it came to discussions about duty and sacrifice. "I didn't walk away from duty," Harry said firmly. "I chose to serve in a different way, one that preserved my family's well-being and mental health." "And perhaps that's exactly what we're doing," Camilla interjected, her voice gentle but firm. "Choosing a way to serve that preserves the institution's well-being for future generations." Charles reached across the table and took Camilla's hand, a gesture of support that reminded everyone of the partnership that had sustained them through decades of challenges. "This decision wasn't made impulsively," Charles explained to his son.
We've spent months consulting constitutional experts, discussing the implications with Commonwealth representatives, and considering the long-term effects on the monarchy. Edward and Sophie, who had remained quiet during the initial exchanges, now added their perspective as working royals who understood both the pressures of public duty and the need for institutional stability. The workload has become unsustainable, Sophie said honestly. Charles and Camilla are carrying responsibilities that were designed for a younger generation, at a time when public expectations have never been higher. And the public scrutiny has intensified exponentially, Edward added. Every decision, every appearance, every personal choice becomes a matter of global debate. It's taking a toll that isn't sustainable long-term. Harry listened thoughtfully to these explanations, his expression revealing the internal struggle between his personal feelings and his understanding of royal pressures. Despite his own conflicts with the institution, he had never lost sight of the human cost of royal service. What about the precedent this sets, he asked. If monarchs can simply step aside when the job becomes too difficult, what does that mean for the stability of the system? It means the system is flexible enough to adapt to human realities rather than being a prison that destroys the people trapped within it, Catherine said softly, her words carrying particular weight given her own experiences with intense public scrutiny. The conversation continued for over 3 hours, touching on constitutional law, family dynamics, personal sacrifice, and the evolving nature of monarchy in the modern world. Gradually, Harry's initial skepticism gave way to understanding, though he continued to press his father and stepmother for details about their planning and preparation for the transition. Have you considered how this affects the Commonwealth realms? Harry asked. Some of those countries are already questioning the relevance of the monarchy. This could accelerate Republican movements. We've been in consultation with Commonwealth representatives, Charles assured him. While there are concerns, there's also recognition that the monarchy's survival depends on its ability to evolve and adapt. As the afternoon progressed, it became clear that Harry's real concern wasn't constitutional protocol but family unity. His own painful exit from royal life had created lasting wounds, and he was genuinely worried about how this new crisis would affect the relationships he was slowly working to rebuild. I can support your decision, Harry said finally, but only if we can find a way to present it that strengthens the family rather than dividing it further. The relief in the room was palpable. Having Harry's support, even with conditions, removed one major obstacle to their ability to present a united front to the public and the press. Margaret appeared in the doorway to announce that the Privy Council had arrived for their emergency meeting. The formal consultation that everyone had been dreading was about to begin, and the outcome could potentially derail their carefully laid plans. The Privy Council meeting took place in the throne room, its formal atmosphere emphasizing the constitutional gravity of the situation. 12 senior advisors, including former prime ministers, archbishops, and legal experts, had gathered to review the royal decision and its implications for British governance. Charles and Camilla sat at the head of the long table, facing a panel of some of the most experienced constitutional minds in the country. The questions came rapidly and covered everything from legal precedents to religious obligations to Commonwealth relations. Your Majesties, said Lord Chief Justice Harrison, while we understand your personal motivations, we must consider whether this decision requires parliamentary approval under the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act. The legal arguments continued for over 2 hours, with various council members citing precedents, questioning authorities, and debating interpretations of centuries-old constitutional arrangements. Through it all, Charles and Camilla maintained their position that they had the right to make personal decisions about their own lives, even within the constraints of royal duty. The coronation oath creates spiritual and constitutional obligations that cannot simply be set aside, argued the Archbishop of York. These vows were made before God and represent a sacred commitment to lifelong service. Camilla felt her patience beginning to fray under the weight of these formal challenges to their decision. Your Grace, she said carefully, with respect, we are not abandoning our commitments. We are fulfilling them in a way that serves the institution's long-term interests. The tide of the meeting shifted when Sir Nicholas Soames, a respected constitutional expert and former parliamentarian, offered a different perspective. The monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years precisely because it has been able to adapt to changing circumstances, he argued.
Edward VIII's abdication, while controversial, ultimately strengthened the crown by bringing George VI to the throne. Perhaps we should consider whether this decision might serve a similar purpose. The comparison to Edward VIII was one that Charles and Camilla had hoped to avoid, but Sir Nicholas's framing presented it as precedent rather than scandal. Other council members began to consider whether voluntary transition might indeed be preferable to the alternatives of incapacity or forced abdication. The critical question, said former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, is whether this decision can be implemented in a way that maintains constitutional stability and public confidence in the monarchy. After intense debate, the Privy Council reached a qualified consensus. They would not formally oppose the royal decision, but they insisted on stringent conditions regarding timing, process, and public communication. The constitutional lawyers would need to draft formal procedures, Parliament would need to be consulted, and the Commonwealth realms would need to be given adequate time to prepare for the transition. This cannot appear to be a sudden or impulsive decision, Lord Harrison warned. The public needs to see that this has been carefully planned and responsibly executed. As the Privy Council meeting concluded, Charles and Camilla felt simultaneously relieved and burdened. They had cleared a major constitutional hurdle, but the conditions attached to the approval would make their journey even more complex and time-consuming. The evening brought the moment they had been preparing for since the crisis began, the televised address to the nation. The blue drawing room had been transformed into a television studio, with cameras, lighting equipment, and technical crews creating an atmosphere of nervous anticipation. Camilla sat before the cameras, wearing a simple navy dress and the same pearl necklace she had chosen for their first public appearance together decades earlier. The symbolism was intentional, a reminder of the journey they had traveled together and the consistency of their partnership through every challenge. The speech she was about to deliver had been rewritten dozens of times, revised by constitutional experts, reviewed by communications specialists, and carefully crafted to address the concerns that had emerged over the past week. But, at its heart, it remained a deeply personal statement about love, duty, and the courage to make difficult choices. My fellow citizens of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, she began, her voice steady despite the enormity of the moment. I speak to you tonight about a decision that His Majesty and I have made after months of careful consideration and consultation. The address lasted 20 minutes and covered their reasoning, the constitutional process they had followed, their commitment to ensuring a smooth transition, and their continued dedication to the values that had guided their service to the Crown. This decision is not about abandoning responsibility, she said, looking directly into the camera. It is about accepting the ultimate responsibility, ensuring that the monarchy continues to serve you effectively for generations to come. When the cameras stopped rolling, the family gathered around her with expressions of pride and support. Even Harry, who had been the most skeptical about their decision, seemed moved by the dignity and grace with which Camilla had addressed the nation. The immediate reaction to the televised address was more positive than anyone had dared to hope. Phone calls and emails to the palace ran heavily in favor of their decision, and early polling showed that a majority of the British public supported their reasoning, even if they were sad to see the change. The BBC is reporting that the speech was well received, Victoria announced as she briefed the family on media reaction. The tone was exactly right, personal but dignified, honest but not overly emotional. Over the following days, international reaction proved equally supportive. European monarchies issued statements of understanding, Commonwealth governments expressed their respect for the decision, and even Republican movements seemed to be caught off guard by the positive public response. 2 weeks after their initial announcement, Charles and Camilla found themselves in the same private sitting room where they had first discussed their momentous decision months earlier. The chaos and controversy had largely subsided, replaced by careful planning for the transition process that would unfold over the coming months. Do you think we'll look back on this as the right choice? Camilla asked as they reviewed the formal timeline that had been established for their transition. Charles took her hand and smiled with the contentment of someone who had finally found peace after a long struggle. I think we'll look back on this as the moment we chose love over fear, and substance over appearance. Margaret knocked softly before entering with their evening tea, a ritual that would continue for as long as they remained in residence at Windsor. Her face showed the quiet satisfaction of someone who had witnessed history being made with grace and dignity.
Your Majesties, she said as she arranged the tea service, if I may speak personally, you have shown the nation what true leadership looks like. You've demonstrated that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is to step aside at the right moment. As evening fell over Windsor Castle, Camilla reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From the young woman who had fallen in love with a prince, through the dark years of scandal and separation, to her eventual transformation into a beloved queen, every step had led to this act of ultimate service. The woman who had once been Britain's most hated person was ending her reign as one of its most respected figures. She had learned that true queenliness wasn't about wearing a crown or sitting on a throne, but about having the wisdom to know when stepping down was the greatest gift you could give to the institution you loved. The future stretched before them, uncertain but filled with possibility. They had shown the world that the monarchy could evolve, that duty could be fulfilled in unexpected ways, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to let go. As they settled into bed for what had been their most peaceful night's sleep in months, Camilla knew that their story was ending exactly as it should, with dignity, with love, and with the knowledge that they had chosen the path of service over the path of convenience. The queen who had never expected to wear the crown was leaving it in exactly the way she had worn it, with grace, with purpose, and with absolute dedication to something larger than herself. It was, she realized, the perfect ending to an imperfect but ultimately triumphant love story.